The morning sun struggled to pierce the thick, grey clouds hanging low over Holleridge Boarding School. A biting wind swept through the skeletal remains of the scaffolding surrounding the old West Wing, carrying with it the stale scent of dust and decay. The crew had arrived early, tension threading through their movements like a live wire, each step careful and deliberate, as if the building itself might crumble beneath their feet. Elliot Graves stood near the entrance, his leather jacket pulled tight against the cold. His weathered face was drawn, shadows deepening beneath his eyes from restless nights spent poring over his journal entries. Entries that had become less about the renovation and more about the whispered voices and the creeping dread that had settled into the bones of the school. "Everyone, stay alert," Elliot called out, voice steady but edged with urgency. "We're halfway through the West Wing demolition today. Watch your surroundings." Jared Morales grunted in acknowledgement, his muscular frame tense as he checked the scaffolding's support. Tommy Briggs, the young apprentice, lingered nearby, eyes wide as he clutched his toolbox, his senses attuned to every creak and whisper that the ancient building seemed to breathe. The work had been progressing, albeit slowly, but just as the crew began removing a particularly unstable section of scaffolding, a sickening crack split the air. The wood groaned and snapped, and in an instant, a mass of debris cascaded down, burying Jared beneath the rubble. "Jared!" Tommy screamed, rushing forward as dust billowed into the chilled air, stinging everyone's eyes and filling their lungs. Panic erupted like wildfire. Men scrambled to lift the heavy beams, their shouts mingling with Jared's groans of pain. Elliot's heart hammered in his chest as he directed the rescue, his voice cutting sharply through the chaos. "Clear the way. Get those beams off him." Minutes felt like hours as the team worked feverishly. Finally, Jared was freed, coughing and bloody, but alive. The gravity of the accident settled over the crew like a suffocating fog. Work halted immediately, and Sheriff Paula Reed arrived swiftly, her expression grim as she surveyed the scene. "This isn't just an accident," she said quietly to Elliot and Maya Chen, who had arrived alongside her. "There's something more here. This place has a history that's not going away." Maya nodded, her eyes heavy with the weight of the records she had been poring over, documents revealing tragedies and cover-ups. Children lost and forgotten. "The more we uncover, the more it feels like the past is bleeding into the present," she murmured. Elliot felt the cold grip of fear tighten around him. As the crew gathered to discuss the next steps, a sudden, chilling whisper brushed past his ear, a soft, almost tender voice calling his name. "Elliot." He froze, blood draining from his face. The voice was impossibly familiar, was the voice of his lost sibling, the one he had buried deep beneath layers of guilt and silence. The whispered call echoed through the hollow corridors, wrapping around him like a shroud. Alone later in the dimly lit project office, Elliot finally allowed the walls he had built around himself to crumble. Tears welled in his eyes as memories surged of laughter abruptly silenced, of a child gone too soon, and of a brother's protective promise broken by absence. The weight of his trauma pressed down with unbearable force, threatening to drown him in despair. Yet beneath the sorrow, a fragile resolve began to take shape. He understood, with painful clarity, that the haunting was not merely a spectral menace, but a manifestation of pain, his pain, and that of countless children who had suffered within these walls. When he emerged from his solitude, the crew was waiting, their faces etched with concern. Jared, bruised but defiant, gave a nod of encouragement. Maya's eyes held steadfast empathy. Even Tommy, nervous but unwavering, looked to him for guidance. Elliot swallowed hard, steadying his voice. "We can't run from this. We have to face it together. For them, and for ourselves. The fragile bonds of the crew, tested by fear and trauma, began to knit anew. But as night fell and shadows deepened around Holleridge, the whispers grew louder, promises of remembrance mingling with threats of despair. The breaking point had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it the faintest echo of a child's laughter rant somewhere. Just beyond the veil of the living, the teeth in the walls gleamed in the darkness, waiting. The air in the old boarding school had turned thick, almost viscous, as if the very atmosphere had congealed into something oppressive and suffocating. Elliot Graves paused in the dim hallway, his eyes narrowing as the flickering beam from his flashlight danced across the cracked plaster walls. What had once been a crumbling, silent corridor now seemed to breathe with a grotesque life of its own. Jagged teeth like ridges were emerging from the walls, sharp, white, and glistening faintly in the weak light. Like the gnashing maw of some subterranean beast, the plaster bulged and rippled, shifting with a slow, sinister pulse, casting long, flickering shadows that flicked across the floor like silent screams frozen in motion. Elliot swallowed hard, the weight of unease pressing down on him as his breath came in shallow bursts. He had seen strange things before: whispers, sudden chills, fleeting apparitions, but this was different. The presence was no longer content to haunt the edges of perception. It was manifesting physically, turning the very fabric of the building into a nightmarish cage. Behind him, the muffled sounds of his crew stirred a mixture of nervous whispers, sharp gasps, and the clatter of shifting tools. "Stay close," Elliot commanded, his voice low but steady. "We need to find a way out before this place closes in on us." Maya Chen moved beside him, clutching a worn leather-bound ledger she had found earlier in the school's dusty archives. Her glasses caught the beam of the flashlight as she squinted at the faded ink. The cold air made her breath visible in the dim light, swirling into ephemeral clouds that seemed to mingle with the whispered voices now circling them like ghostly tendrils. The voices were faint but unmistakable soft cries, broken laughter, the rustling of unseen children's footsteps echoing just beyond the edge of hearing. "These markings," Maya murmured, tracing a finger over a series of cryptic symbols scrawled in the margins of the ledger. "They're messages, warnings. The spirits are trying to tell us something." Elliot nodded grimly. "Then we need to listen, and fast." Their footsteps echoed hollowly as they navigated the twisting corridors, the walls seeming to close in with every step. Tommy Briggs, the young apprentice, trailed behind, clutching a small flashlight with trembling hands. His wide eyes darted nervously from shadow to shadow, the flickering light revealing fleeting, childlike forms that melted away whenever anyone tried to focus on them. Suddenly, Jared Morales let out a strangled cry. Elliot spun around just in time to see him grappling with a shadowy figure that coalesced into the shape of a small child. The apparition's hollow eyes seemed to plead silently, its form shifting like smoke, yet heavy with an almost unbearable weight. Jared struggled, muscles straining as the dark embrace tightened around him, sapping his strength and resolve. "Jared," Elliot barked, rushing to his side. With a desperate shove, he broke the spectral hold, sending the apparition spiraling into the air only to dissolve into a swirl of mist. The worker collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his face pale and slick with sweat. "We can't fight them," Maya whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to understand them." Elliot glanced back down the corridor, where the walls pulsed rhythmically, the sound resembling a distant heartbeat echoing through the building's bowels. It was a cruel, mocking rhythm, like the building itself was alive, watching, waiting. The crew was caught in a labyrinth, not just of brick and mortar, but of memory and pain, where every shadow held a fragment of the past's sorrow. "Keep moving," Elliot urged, determination hardening his voice. "We find the shrine Maya mentioned. It's our best chance to calm this place." As they pressed forward, the teeth in the walls seemed to close ranks behind them, sealing off escape routes and twisting familiar spaces into alien corridors. Whispers followed them, voices layering over one another in a cacophony of grief and accusation. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and resolve coursing through his veins. The building was no longer just a structure, it was a living nightmare, a tomb of memories and lost innocence, and they were trapped inside its jaws. But Elliot was not ready to surrender. Not yet. Not while there was breath in his lungs and hope to be grasped amid the shadows and teeth. He glanced at Maya, who met his gaze with fierce, quiet courage. Together, with the others close behind, they stepped deeper into the abyss, ready to confront the sorrow that had taken root in the walls. The echoes of children's voices swirled around them, growing louder, more insistent. Somewhere ahead, a faint glow promised answers or doom. And as the walls pulsed again, Elliot felt the presence watching, waiting to reveal its next move. The nightmare was far from over. The walls seemed to breathe as Elliot stepped deeper into the shadowed corridor, the dim light flickering uncertainly overhead. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards beneath his boots, a pulse that matched the quickening beat of his heart. The whispers returned, soft and indistinct, curling round the edges of his consciousness like cold fingers. He paused, pressing his palm against the peeling wallpaper, feeling a strange warmth beneath the surface, an impossible contradiction that unsettled him more than the cold draft that swept past. Memories surged unbidden, crashing against the fragile barrier of his mind. A child's laughter from years ago, broken by the sudden sharpness of a scream. The face of his lost sibling, eyes wide with fear and pleading for protection he had failed to give. His breath hitched, and for a moment the corridors seemed to warp, stretching endlessly into darkness before folding back on itself like a twisted maze. Behind him, the faint sound of footsteps echoed Jared's voice calling out, strained and shaky. Elliot turned, catching sight of the muscular man frozen mid-step, eyes glazed over as if trapped in a distant battlefield. The clang of explosions and the stench of smoke engulfed Jared's senses, drawing him into a nightmare that had nothing to do with the school, but was as real as the cold sweat rolling down his temple. "Jared, snap out of it." Elliot's voice was sharp but filled with concern. The man blinked rapidly, shaking his head as the hallucination ebbed. He leaned heavily against the wall, breathing hard. It's just the noise," Jared muttered, voice rough. "I can't." Before Elliot could respond, a soft voice drifted through the emirs. She stood nearby, clutching a fragile yellowed photograph, her glasses glinting in the weak light. Her fingers trembled as she held up the image, revealing a group of children smiling shyly in front of the very building that now loomed around them. "Look at this," she whispered, eyes moist. "These were the ones we lost. Forgotten faces, stories buried beneath the rubble." Elliot stepped closer, reading the faded handwriting on the back of the photo. The words told of a harsh winter, of children who huddled in hidden corners to escape cold and cruelty. Maya's voice grew stronger as she read aloud from a diary she had found, a child's desperate plea for kindness and safety that was met instead with neglect and silence. The room seemed to shudder with the weight of unspoken sorrow. Shadows lengthened and twisted, taking on shapes that defied logic. From the corner, Tommy's quiet gasps drew their attention. The young apprentice clutched his chest, eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. Around him, the shadows coalesced into vague, childlike forms, specters that whispered secrets only the sensitive could hear. "They're here," Tommy breathed, his voice barely audible. "They want us to remember." Elliot felt the sting of tears he refused to shed. The presence was no longer an external terror, but a mirror reflecting their own scars each, worker marked by trauma, both ancient and recent. He realized then that the building was not just haunted by ghosts, but by memory itself, a living archive of pain and loss. "We have to face this," he said quietly, turning to the crew. "Not just for them, but for ourselves." The corridor seemed to pulse in response, the air thick with anticipation and dread. Reality bent and twisted, but in that moment, Elliot found a fragile thread of resolve. The past would not stay buried, and neither would his own fears. To survive, they would have to unravel the tangled web of history and trauma entwined within these walls, and confront the darkness lurking in their own hearts. As the whispers grew louder, Elliot opened his journal, his pen poised to capture the story unfolding around them, a story of memory, pain, and the desperate hope for redemption. But somewhere deep in the walls, the teeth waited, gleaming faintly in the shadows, hungry for the truth they had long been denied. And the nightmare was far from over. The air grew thicker. The Father Elliot Graves, Maya Chen, and Jared Morales descended into the shadowed veins of Holleridge boarding school's forgotten underbelly. The faint glow of their flashlights barely pierced the suffocating gloom, painting fractured shapes on the peeling walls and casting long, twitching shadows that seemed to breathe beneath their gaze. The narrow corridor twisted and narrowed, its dust-choked silence broken only by the soft scrape of boots on cracked tile and the distant drip of water echoing like the heartbeat of the building itself. Elliot's voice was low but steady as he whispered, "Keep close. These passages weren't meant to be found." Maya adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the faded scrawls etched into the wall's childish drawings of stick figures, fractured houses, and jagged teeth. "It's like the building remembers," she murmured, tracing a trembling finger over a crude sketch of a child's face, eyes hollow and sad. Jared's muscular frame tensed beside them, his usual skepticism waning as the oppressive atmosphere gnawed at his nerves. "Feels like the walls are watching us," he muttered, voiced rough with unease. A sudden chorus of whispers rose around them, barely audible at first, then swelling into a sorrowful harmony that clawed at their senses. Names were called soft, pleading voices weaving through the stale air like a mournful hymn. Elliot's heart clenched as he recognized his own name whispered back to him, a spectral echo of his past. The trio pressed onward, each step heavier than the last, the boundary between reality and nightmare blurring with every breath. A chilling draft swept past, carrying the scent of old paper, damp earth, and something faintly metallic like blood long forgotten. Then, without warning, Jared stumbled, his foot catching on a loose stone. His flashlight swung wildly, illuminating a fleeting apparitioner, childlike silhouette with glowing eyes, its form flickering like a candle flame buffeted by a ghostly wind. The figure's translucent hand reached out, fingers stretching toward Jared's shoulder before dissolving into the wall's rough surface. Jared swallowed hard, voice barely a whisper. "Did you see that?" Maya stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached out toward where the apparition had vanished. "There's so much pain here," she said, voice thick with emotion. "It's like they're trapped, begging to be remembered." Elliot's gaze fixed on a cracked plaster wall that seemed to pulse faintly, as if breathing. The whispered voices crescendoed into a desperate plea for recognition and acknowledgement. His own buried memories surged loss, guilt, and the long shadow cast by his siblings, death melding with the collective sorrow trapped within these walls. "We can't turn away now," he declared, voice resolute despite the tremor beneath. "This place is more than a building. It's a prison of memories, ours and theirs. We have to face it, no matter what it takes." The passage twisted once more, leading them deeper into the abyss where the line between past and present, seen and unseen, began to unravel. Shadows coalesced into shapes that whispered secrets and sorrow, inviting them into a confrontation not just with the haunted school, but with the darkness within themselves. As the walls seemed to close in, alive with teeth like cracks and shifting shadows, Elliot knew the journey was only beginning. Somewhere in this labyrinth lay the key to peace or their undoing, and the whispers never ceased. The air inside the hidden chamber was thick with a cold, clammy stillness that pressed against Elliot Graves' skin like a living weight. Flickering worklights cast long, quivering shadows across the cracked plaster walls, where jagged, teeth-like shapes seemed to writhe and shift, as though the building itself were breathing in slow, measured pulses. Elliot took a cautious step forward, every instinct screaming that he should flee, yet something deeper held him rooted in place. Around him, the amorphous shadows coalesced, coiling into fleeting glimpses of childlike figures. Their faces blurred and indistinct, but the sorrow in their presence was unmistakably raw, aching lament that seeped into the bones. The whispered voices swirled, rising and falling like a mournful tide, murmuring names, half-formed memories, and fragmented pleas for recognition. Elliot, a soft, trembling voice echoed through the chamber, barely more than a breath. "Remember us. See us." He swallowed hard, the words striking a chord deep within his chest. "I see you," he whispered back, voice trembling yet resolute. "I remember." Behind him, footsteps echoed as Maya Chen approached, clutching a fragile, dust-covered diary she had found nestled among the debris of a forgotten room. Her glasses caught the dim light, and her eyes shone with a fierce determination. Jared Morales followed, his muscular frame tense, hands clenched tightly around a length of pipe as if it were a lifeline. "The children," Maya said softly, her voice breaking the oppressive silence. "They were never forgotten, not completely, but their stories were buried beneath layers of neglect and silence." Jared's jaw tightened. "I thought this was just an old building with bad memories, but it's more than that. It's a wound that never healed." Elliot nodded, feeling the weight of their shared understanding. This presence, the collective, it's the embodiment of all that pain and loss. It's not evil in the way we think of it. It's sorrow made manifest, a desperate plea for acknowledgement. The walls around them pulsed, the plaster seeming to breathe as spectral faces flashed briefly, eyes wide with silent anguish. The teeth-like shapes shifted and snapped softly, a grim reminder of the torment etched into the very bones of the building. "We can't let this cycle continue," Elliot said, voice steady despite the tremors beneath his skin. "They need to be remembered, to be seen, and so do we." A crescendo of whispered voices erupted suddenly, swirling into a cacophony of lost cries and fragmented memories. The crew instinctively huddled together, hearts pounding in a shared rhythm of fear and resolve. "We face this together," Elliot declared, meeting Maya's and Jared's eyes. "We acknowledge the pain. We refuse to be broken by it." For a moment, the oppressive darkness seemed to hesitate, the spectral children's faces softening as if touched by a fragile hope. The cycle of silence and neglect trembled on the edge of fracture, and within that fragile space, the possibility of peace glimmered like a distant star. But the presence was patient, ancient. It had waited decades, feeding on forgotten sorrow and whispered neglect. The path ahead would be long, fraught with hardship and haunted by shadows of the past. As Elliot took a deep breath, he knew one thing with certainty. To break the cycle, they had to confront not only the ghosts in the walls, but also the ghosts within themselves. Only then could the children and the living find a measure of peace. And so, in the heart of the abandoned school, amid shifting shadows and whispered memories, a fragile dialogue began, a conversation between the living and the lost, between remembrance and oblivion, between despair and hope. The walls listened, the children waited, and Elliot Graves, once a skeptic bound by his own fears, became a reluctant messenger for the voiceless, standing at the threshold of the unknown, determined to shed light on the darkness and honor the stories that refused to fade. The battle for remembrance had begun. The chamber grew still again, but the echoes lingered, a reminder that the collective presence was not yet ready to rest. It demanded more acknowledgement, more truth, more courage. Elliot glanced at Maya and Jared, their faces set with grim determination. "We have a choice," he said quietly. "We can give in to fear and let the past consume us, or we can face it and break the cycle." For the first time, the possibility of hope felt real, fragile, yes, but undeniable. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it the faintest murmur of a child's voice, soft as a breath, "Remember us." And somewhere deep within the walls, the teeth snapped once more, not in anger, but in anticipation.